Imagine waking up to the sound of sirens wailing through your neighborhood. The air is tense. People are rushing, whispering, wondering what's happening. You step outside and see planes overhead foreign, ones dropping, not leaflets, but bombs. The world has changed overnight. That's what it felt like for millions of people on September 1st, 1939. But to truly understand how we got there, to the moment when World War II officially began, we have to rewind the clock a bit further back to the smoldering embers left behind by the First. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But instead of healing, it left a fractured world, economically devastated, politically unstable, and morally shaken. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended World War I, but it didn't foster peace. Instead, it sowed the seeds of resentment, especially in Germany. The treaty blamed Germany entirely for the war, forced it to pay crippling reparations, stripped it of territory, and limited its military. It was humiliation written in legal ink. And when people feel humiliated, desperate, and cornered, they often turn to anyone who promises to restore their pride. Enter Adolf Hitler, a failed artist turned political firebrand. Hitler rose through the ranks of the newly formed Nazi Party with fiery speeches, promises of German resurgence, and a scapegoat the Jews. Germany, he claimed, was stabbed in the back during the First War, and only he could bring it back to glory. By the early 1930s, Germany was in the midst of a Great Depression, and Hitler's message resonated. He was appointed Chancellor in 1933, not long after he dismantled democracy in Germany, piece by piece. By 1934, he was the Führer, holding complete control over a nation hungry for revival. But while Hitler was consolidating power, other dominoes were falling around the world. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had embraced fascism in the 1920s and was flexing its muscles in North Africa. In Asia, Japan had become a rising military power, invading Manchuria in 1931, and later China in 1937. These weren't isolated events, they were connected, symptoms of a world disillusioned with peace and infatuated with power. Democracies hesitated. They watched, condemned, but acted too slowly. Meanwhile, Hitler was testing the limits. In 1936, he sent troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone bordering France. It was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The world did nothing. That same year, the Spanish Civil War broke out. Hitler and Mussolini used it as a testing ground for their new war machines, aiding the fascist General Franco. Again, the world watched, debated, and did nothing. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions were clearer. He annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss, claiming it was simply reuniting German-speaking peoples. No bloodshed. It's just a handshake and a flag swap. And again, the world let it slide. Britain and France, haunted by the horrors of the First World War, pursued a policy called appeasement, giving Hitler what he wanted, in hopes he would stop there. But he didn't. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet Hitler. For months, very little happened on the Western Front. This period came to be known as the Phony War. People were bracing for impact, but the bombs hadn't fallen yet. Now it was clear this wasn't about German unity, it was about domination. They attacked Finland in the brutal Winter War of 1939-1940. Though the Finns put up a fierce fight, they were ultimately forced to cede territory. Stalin was also annexing the Baltic states Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, quietly expanding his empire. In August 1939, just days before the war began, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with secret clauses to divide Eastern Europe between them. Stalin, the Soviet leader, was buying time. Hitler was eliminating the threat of a two-front war, and Poland was left alone in the middle, unaware that both giants were preparing to carve it in half. Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand. Poland. It was called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Terrifying combination of fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and relentless airstrikes. Within weeks, Poland was overwhelmed. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. And just like that, Poland was gone. Hitler invaded Poland, They said there would be war. What came out of it was the Munich Agreement. Czechoslovakia was in tea. Even at the tableland, the Sudetenland was handed over to Germany. Chamberlain returned to Britain declaring peace for our time, but in truth it was just a pause before the storm. The following March, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. But Hitler wasn't worried. He had a plan. And then came September 1st, 1939. At dawn, German forces invaded Poland with a level of speed and coordination the world had never seen before. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days after the initial invasion, but their response was limited. They didn't invade Germany. They didn't bomb Berlin. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviets were tightening their grip. Back in Germany, Hitler was preparing his next move. He had conquered Poland, but Western Europe was still free. He turned his eyes toward Scandinavia. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered in a day. Norway held out longer, but eventually fell. Control of Norway gave Germany access to vital iron ore shipments and naval bases resources they would need for the next phase, and then the real storm broke. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded France not through the heavily defended Maginot Line, but through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium, a route the French believed was impassable for tanks. It wasn't. The German army moved with blistering speed, bypassing French defenses and driving toward the English Channel. From May 26 to June 4th, a hastily organized evacuation known as Operation Dynamo managed to rescue over 330,000 Allied soldiers across the Channel using naval vessels, fishing boats, even private yachts. And it showed something important. The Nazi war machine wasn't invincible. Across the Atlantic, the United States was watching carefully. And soon, battles would rage not just in Europe, but across deserts, jungles, oceans, and skies. World War II wasn't just a conflict between nations, it was a total war, a fight for the very soul of humanity. And the next chapter would take us even deeper into the chaos. It wasn't involved yet, but it was sending aid to Britain through programs like Lend-Lease. And in the Pacific, tensions with Japan were growing by the day. Britain was saved, but barely. France was not. With Winston Churchill now as Prime Minister, a man who had warned for years about the dangers of appeasement, the British braced for invasion. But first, Hitler needed control of the skies. The Allied forces were caught off guard, outmaneuvered, and nearly surrounded. In less than 6 weeks, one of the most powerful countries in Europe had fallen. Hitler now controlled most of Western Europe. Only Britain stood defiant. The German Luftwaffe launched a massive aerial campaign aimed at destroying the Royal Air Force and breaking British morale. London and other cities were bombed relentlessly in what became known as the Blitz. But Britain didn't break. The RAF, though outnumbered, held the line.
All the British radar technology?
Home field advantage and sheer grit turned the tide. The British Expeditionary Force and remnants of the French army were pushed back to the port of Dunkirk. What happened next was both a disaster and a miracle. By mid-June 1940, German troops entered Paris. France surrendered shortly after. And standing defiant was exactly what Britain did. Thus began the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. By October, Hitler postponed his invasion plans indefinitely. It was his first major defeat, but this was just the beginning. World War II was about to expand far beyond Europe. The world was about to catch fire. Allies would form. Axis powers would push harder. It's the summer of 1941. Europe is mostly under Nazi control. France has fallen, the Low Countries are occupied, and Britain stands alone as a stubborn island of resistance. Hitler is at the peak of his power. To many, it seems like the Axis cannot be stopped. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. And Hitler, emboldened by his victories, is about to make a catastrophic decision, one that will dramatically change the course of the war. Let's talk about Operation Barbarossa. Despite the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Hitler had always planned to invade the East. To him, the Soviet Union was more than just a threat. It was a land of Lebensraum, or living space, that he believed Germany needed to grow. And ideologically, he saw communism as a disease. The plan to invade the Soviet Union had been forming in his mind for years. It had taken Manchuria in 1931, invaded China in 1937, and by 1940 had aligned itself with Germany and Italy under the Tripartite Pact. The U.S. didn't like Japan's expansion, especially in Southeast Asia, which threatened Western colonies and American interests. In response, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and cut off oil exports. For Japan, that was a red line. Without oil, their military machine would grind to a halt. And now, with France defeated and Britain bombed into a stalemate, he saw the opportunity. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Over 3 million Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. The scale was staggering armies moving across a front over 1,800 miles long. The Soviets were caught off guard, and for a time it looked like the Nazi plan might actually work. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union would collapse in a matter of months. But he underestimated two things: the Russian winter and the will of the Soviet people. Stalin had ignored multiple warnings from spies and even Winston Churchill. The roads turned to mud in the autumn rainza, season the Russians call Rasputin by winter. Temperatures dropped to bone-cracking lows. German tanks froze. Soldiers lacked proper clothing. Engines wouldn't start. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. And in the shadow of the Kremlin, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive. The Germans, who had gotten within sight of Moscow, were pushed back. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver a knockout blow. The Eastern Front was now a brutal, grinding war of attrition that would eventually consume millions of lives. When the attack came, the Red Army was unprepared, poorly positioned, and in many areas, simply overwhelmed. Cities fell quickly: Minsk, Smolensk, Kyiv. Thousands of Soviet troops were captured in massive encirclements. Entire divisions were wiped out. As the Germans pushed toward Moscow, their supply lines grew longer and thinner. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, another major player was about to ignite its own firestorm: Japan. Japan had been expanding aggressively for years. So Japan made a bold decision. It would strike the United States hard, fast, and without warning. On December 7, 1941, just before 8 a.m., Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was a meticulously planned assault designed to cripple the Pacific Fleet. Battleships were bombed, aircraft destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and now the United States were finally unified in their fight against the Axis. But instead of crippling America, Pearl Harbor awakened it. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. And a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Just like that, the world was officially at war on a truly global scale. Now, the conflict spanned Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Within months, it captured Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and Indonesia. The speed of their conquests was shocking. The British fortress of Singapore, considered nearly impregnable, fell in just over a week. Montgomery's forces launched a massive assault, and after days of bitter fighting, pushed Rommel back. Around the same time, U.S. and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The Axis powers in North Africa were now being squeezed from both east and west. By May 1943, they surrendered. North Africa was in Allied hands. U.S. forces in the Philippines, under General Douglas MacArthur, were forced to retreat. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were captured and forced on the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands died from starvation, exhaustion, and abuse. Germany's Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was leading the Afrika Korps in a push toward the Suez Canal. British forces, under General Bernard Montgomery, were locked in a deadly back-and-forth with Axis troops across the harsh desert terrain. But victory was still far away. In the Pacific, Japan went on a rampage. At the Battle of Midway, U.S. naval forces under Admiral Chester Nimitz ambushed and destroyed for Japanese aircraft. Carriers crippling Japan's naval air power, it was a stunning victory and marked the beginning of a long, brutal campaign of island hopping as Allied forces began to claw their way across the Pacific. But as Japan expanded, it also exposed its supply lines, making it vulnerable to counterattack. In June 1942, the tide in the Pacific began to turn. Back in Europe, the war was escalating on multiple fronts. North Africa had become a critical theater. The turning point came in late 1942 at the Second Battle of El Alamein. But the real meat grinder of the war was on the Eastern Front. After the failure to take Moscow, Hitler shifted his focus south toward the oil-rich Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army advanced into the city. Stalin ordered his troops not to take a single step back. The Soviets and Germans fought building by building, room by room, sometimes hand to hand. The brutality was unimaginable. And as winter returned, the Soviets encircled the German Sixth Army in a massive pincer movement. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. By February 1943, the Germans surrendered. Over 300,000 Axis troops were killed or captured. Stalingrad was a turning point, not just militarily, but psychologically. The Nazi aura of invincibility was shattered. But even during the war, stories leaked out. Few believed them at first. The goal: to open a second front, relieve pressure on the Soviets, and begin the final push toward Nazi Germany. It would require immense coordination, deception, and sacrifice. But it was coming. The war, though far from over, was beginning to turn. The scale of evil was almost too great to comprehend. What followed was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Stalingrad was more than a city, it was a symbol. From there, the Soviets began to push westward, slowly grinding down the German war machine. Meanwhile, in Italy, cracks were appearing in the Axis alliance. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Hitler's final solution had turned from forced deportation and ghettos to industrial-scale murder. Death camps, like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, became factories of death, where men, women, and children were gassed, burned, and buried in mass graves. Millions of others Roma people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and more were also targeted. The invasion was successful, and it led to the downfall of Mussolini. He was arrested and Italy surrendered in September. But the war in Italy wasn't over. German troops quickly occupied the country, setting up a puppet government in the north and turning the Italian peninsula into a brutal battleground. The Allies had to fight their way up, town by town, mountain by mountain, against entrenched German resistance. It was slow, costly, and deadly. And even as battles raged in Europe, atrocities were unfolding in the shadows. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, was accelerating. For many, the true horror of the Holocaust would only be fully revealed after the war ended. By late 1943, the Allies were planning something massive: an invasion of Western Europe. The Axis powers were bleeding, the Allies were rising, and the greatest invasion in human history was just on the horizon. It's the early hours of June 6, 1944, off the coast of Normandy. The sea churns with thousands of Allied ships, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft packed with soldiers from America, Britain, Canada, and more. The beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Above them, a sky full of airplanes. Behind them, years of planning, sacrifice, and anticipation. Ahead of them, fortified beaches, barbed wire, landmines, machine guns. This was D-Day. It involved over 150,000 troops landing on 5 separate beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The operation relied on complex deception plans to fool the Germans into thinking the real attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Over the next few weeks, more than 1 million Allied troops would pour into France, pushing through hedgerows, fighting in villages, and gradually breaking out into open countryside. And Free French forces under Charles de Gaulle, alongside Allied troops, entered the city. Crowds cheered, tears flowed. It was a moment of profound joy and a symbol of hope that the nightmare was ending. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, phantom radio chatter, it was a masterclass in misdirection. Let's take a step back and understand what it took to get here. After years of brutal fighting across Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, the Allies had been preparing for a massive invasion of Western Europe. The goal: open a true second front, and start pushing back German forces from the west, while the Soviets continued pressing from the east. The invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the largest amphibious assault in history. When the first waves of troops hit the beaches, they were met with fierce resistance, especially at Omaha Beach, where U.S. forces were pinned down by a heavy machine gun fire. The sand turned red. Soldiers clung to hedgehogs and craters, waiting for any chance to advance. But they did. Inch by bloody inch, they climbed the bluffs, broke through German defenses, and began moving inland. But deception could only get them so far. By nightfall, the Allies had established a foothold. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was the beginning. And from there, the liberation of Western Europe began. Paris was freed in August 1944. French resistance fighters rose up from within. But the war was far from over. As Allied forces advanced from the west, the Soviet Red Army was crushing German lines from the east. After years of grueling battles, they had pushed through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. In January 1945, they launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, steamrolling toward Berlin. It caught the Allies by surprise. The Germans pushed through the thin American lines, creating a massive bulge in the front, hence the name. The Battle of the Bulge. Entire German divisions were shattered. The Soviets liberated Auschwitz and other camps, revealing the true scale of Nazi atrocities to the world. American units like those in Bastogne were surrounded, holding on by a thread. In the east, the Soviets launched a final, relentless push toward Berlin. German cities became battlegrounds. Civilians fled or hid in terror. Hitler, refusing to leave his bunker in Berlin, barked impossible orders to ghost armies that no longer existed. They had spent what was left of their offensive power and lost. From that point on, it was a straight shot into the heart of Germany. Supplies were low. Temperatures were freezing. But they refused to surrender. The famous reply from General McAuliffe when asked to give up? Just one word. Nuts. But Hitler wasn't giving up. The war in Europe was over. Crowds celebrated across London, Paris, and New York. People danced in the streets. Families embraced. The nightmare had ended, at least in Europe. In December 1944, he launched a desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same forested region used to invade France years earlier. It was Hitler's last gamble. For a time, it worked. The weather grounded Allied air support. Eventually, the skies cleared, reinforcements arrived, and the Germans were pushed back. As Allied forces moved across the Rhine, cities like Cologne and Frankfurt fell. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Adolf Hitler took his own life. A week later, on May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. But the war wasn't over. Half a world away, the Pacific was still a raging inferno. Since Midway, the Allies had been island hopping, capturing strategic islands and moving ever closer to Japan. The fighting was savage. On islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, Japanese soldiers fought to the death. It was volcanic rock, heavily fortified, and fiercely defended. Nearly 7,000 Americans died capturing the island. In March, the Allies took Okinawa, even closer to Japan. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, over 12,000 Americans killed, and tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians. The cost of invading mainland Japan loomed in. It was terrifying. Surrender was not part of their code. They viewed death in battle as honorable, even preferred. Japan still had a formidable army and was training civilians to fight with bamboo spears if necessary. But in the shadows, the U.S. had been developing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. This made every island a fortress and every battle a bloodbath. Official documents were signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. But it also taught the world lessons about the dangers of extremism, the cost of indifference, and the power of unity in the face of darkness. In February 1945, U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima. Estimates suggested that a full-scale invasion could cost up to 1 million American lives and millions more Japanese. The Manhattan Project, an ultra-secret scientific program, had built an atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, tens of thousands were killed. The city was obliterated. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan, devastated and overwhelmed, surrendered on August 15th. World War II, after 6 years of destruction, over 70 million lives lost. An entire continent's changed forever was finally over. Europe was physically and politically divided. Germany was split into occupation zones. Japan was occupied and rebuilt. Colonial empires crumbled. The United Nations was formed to try to prevent another global war. But what came next was just as important. The war had reshaped the globe. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. And for the survivors, for the Holocaust victims, the refugees, the bombed-out families rebuilding, was a long and painful journey. World War II left scars, on land, on cities, on hearts. The question now was, would we remember those lessons? And in the post-war world, how would we choose to live with the past? The guns had fallen silent. The flags of surrender had been raised. Cities lay in rubble, and the bodies, millions of them, were buried or still unaccounted for. World War II was over, but peace didn't feel like peace for many. It was a new world now. Entire cities, Warsaw, Berlin, Dresden, London, had been bombed to ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Railways, bridges, factories, farms all gone or heavily damaged. In Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and more, civilians wandered through rubble trying to find shelter, food, lost family. These were the first international war crimes tribunals in history. 6 million Jews. Millions of others, Roma, disabled LGBTQ individuals, political prisoners, murdered. It left a permanent scar on the soul of humanity. It also led to the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the formation of Israel in 1948. Response to a people left stateless and slaughtered. For crimes against peace, for crimes against humanity, the world sought accountability. Men like Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess stood in the dock, while prosecutors from the Allied powers presented damning evidence. Films, photographs, documents, and testimonies. Following orders would no longer be a defense. In the Soviet Union, entire regions had been burned to the ground. The death toll was staggering. Over 70 million people had perished worldwide, many of them civilians. The world trying to heal, rebuild, and figure out what would come next. Let's begin with the most immediate reality, the devastation. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Europe, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, they found skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, gas chambers, mass graves.
8.
Soldiers wept. Journalists wrote with shaking hands. No one had ever imagined that industrialized genocide could exist on such a scale. Europe, once a center of civilization, lay shattered. But it wasn't just the physical destruction that had to be faced. It was the emotional and moral scars. The Holocaust left a wound so deep, it's still difficult to comprehend. The Nuremberg trials would later bring some of the Nazi leadership to justice. But justice, however necessary, could not undo the damage. In Asia, the aftermath was just as complex. Japan, once a mighty imperial power, was now a nation in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been obliterated by atomic bombs. Tokyo, like many Japanese cities, had been firebombed into ash. Millions were homeless. Its military was dismantled. A new constitution was written, giving women the right to vote and renouncing war as a national policy. War criminals were tried, including former Prime Minister Tojo, and while Japan had lost its empire, it began laying the groundwork for what would eventually become an economic miracle in the decades to follow. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania all became part of the Soviet sphere. Winston Churchill famously described it in 1946, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Emperor Hirohito, who had once been revered as a divine figure, made a radio address for the first time telling the Japanese people they must endure the unendurable. And just like that, the world split into two hostile camps. The battle lines were now ideological, economic, and diplomatic. Nuclear weapons made open war too dangerous. But proxy wars, espionage, and political maneuvering would define the next 45 years. The nation surrendered. and for the first time in its history, Japan was occupied by a foreign power. It wasn't just charity, it was strategy. Prosperous Europe would be a stable Europe, and a stable Europe wouldn't fall into the Soviet orbit. They needed each other to defeat Hitler, but their ideologies, capitalism versus communism, were fundamentally opposed. And as the dust of war settled, tensions began to rise. That occupier was the United States. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, Japan underwent a dramatic transformation. But amid the ashes of World War II, a new conflict was quietly brewing. The alliance between the US and the Soviet Union had been a marriage of convenience. In Eastern Europe, Soviet forces didn't leave the countries they had liberated. Instead, they installed communist governments loyal to Moscow. The Cold War had begun. To counter Soviet influence, the United States implemented the Marshall Plan, an ambitious program to rebuild Europe, offering billions in aid to any country willing to reject communism. In 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed, a military alliance of Western democracies. In response, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact. Back home in the US, the end of the war sparked massive social and economic change. The GI Bill helped returning veterans go to college, buy homes, and start businesses. Suburbs expanded. The American economy boomed, but not everyone shared equally in the post-war prosperity. African Americans, many of whom had fought bravely in the war, turned to segregation, discrimination, and limited opportunities. Their experience abroad and their frustration at home would help fuel the civil rights movement in the coming decades. Women, who had taken up factory jobs and kept the economy running during the war, were often expected to return to the home. India gained independence from Britain in 1947. Indonesia broke from Dutch rule. African nations began pushing for freedom. The war had exposed the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. Decolonization was messy, often violent, but unstoppable. But many didn't want to. The seeds of second-wave feminism had been planted. Around the world, the colonial order was unraveling. Movies like The Best Years of Our Lives depicted the challenges veterans faced in returning home. It was flawed. Power politics still played a role, but it was a start. Nations began to talk, negotiate, and form institutions meant to preserve peace. The phrase "never again" became a global mantra not just for Jews, but for all people who might suffer under tyranny, genocide, or war. The idea of international cooperation gained ground, even if imperfectly. Writers grappled with trauma, loss, and the moral ambiguity of victory. It gave rise to the modern era, time of progress and peril, opportunity and conflict. And even now, we're still living in the shadow of that war. Philosophers question humanity's nature, and the field of psychology turned more toward understanding trauma and PTSD. European powers, weakened by war, could no longer hold on to their empires. Culturally, the war left deep impressions of humanity's power and its potential for self-destruction. The arms race that followed would define global politics for decades. Duck-O-Can covered drills in classrooms, fallout shelters, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The threat of annihilation loomed like a permanent shadow. In art, literature, and film, people struggled to make sense of what had happened. And perhaps most significantly, the atomic bomb had changed everything. The mushroom cloud over Hiroshima was more than a military weapon, it was a symbol. But amid the uncertainty, there was also hope. The United Nations was formed in 1945 with the goal of preventing future world wars. And most of all, the world remembered. Memorials were built. Histories were written. Survivors spoke. World War II left a blueprint for both destruction and resilience. In many ways, the post-war world was shaped just as much by how people chose to respond to the trauma as by the trauma itself. Let's pause for a moment and look around the world today. Nations ally and argue in the halls of the United Nations. Military alliances like NATO still stand. The threat of nuclear war, though less immediate, still hums quietly beneath the surface. We teach the Holocaust in schools. We visit museums and memorials. We debate nationalism, fascism, war, and peace. And if we really want to understand our present hand, prepare for the future, we have to keep asking the hard questions about that war. Not just what happened, but why. All of this, every bit of it, traces its roots back to World War II. Because World War II isn't just history, it's legacy. The US and the USSR had cooperated to defeat the Nazis, but deep down, they never trusted each other. Once the common enemy was gone, their differences became irreconcilable. The arms race. The space race. For many nations, it became a turning point in their national story. After the war, Germany was divided into East and West. In the West, it's a process called Vergangenheitsbald, coming to terms with the past begone. Germans were taught about the Holocaust in schools. Monuments were built. Laws against hate speech and Holocaust denial were passed. The country became one of the strongest advocates for human rights in the modern world, not because it forgot what happened, but because it remembered. The proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the reason the world is organized the way it is, shaped not just borders, but beliefs. So let's talk about that legacy. After 1945, the United States emerged not just victorious, but transformed. No longer an isolationist country, peering cautiously at the world, America became a global superpower, militarily, economically, and culturally. Its industries had boomed during the war. Its homeland was untouched. In its values, freedom, democracy, capitalism became the ideological counterpoint to Soviet communism. The Cold War that followed was, in many ways, an extension of World War II's unfinished business. These weren't random events. They were born in the ashes of World War II. A world split between East and West, liberty and control, open markets and state economies. And this ideological struggle would define the second half of the 20th century. But the legacy runs deeper than politics and bombs. Let's talk about identity. The war challenged people everywhere to rethink who they were. Germany had to reckon with the unimaginable. How could a cultured, educated society descend into genocidal madness? Japan, too, had to face its actions. The occupation period forced a reckoning with its militarism. But unlike Germany, Japan's confrontation with its past was more complicated and at times controversial. Discussions about war crimes, comfort women, and imperial aggressions still provoke tension, especially with neighbors like China and Korea. The scale of the genocide shattered any illusions about safety in the diaspora. The creation of Israel in 1948 was a direct response to that horror. A homeland, a place to call their own. But this too came with complexity. The displacement of Palestinians, ongoing conflict, and the lasting political reverberations of that decision are still felt today. Yet Japan's post-war transformation into a pacifist, tech-driven democracy is one of the most dramatic in modern history. And then there's the Jewish people. The Holocaust wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. World War II also changed how we think about war itself. The Geneva Conventions were updated, that when people stop participating, stop paying attention, stop questioning authority, it can crumble. It showed us how fear can be weaponized, how leaders can use crises to seize power, scapegoat minorities, and silence dissent. It reminded us that evil doesn't always wear a villain's costume. Sometimes it shows up wrapped in flags and speeches. The idea of war crimes became widely accepted. Terms like crimes against humanity and genocide entered the global vocabulary. It's the ultimate human drama, and we keep telling it because it helps us understand not just the past, but ourselves. The United Nations, though often flawed, became a forum where nations could at least try to resolve conflict with words instead of weapons. Peacekeeping missions, humanitarian aid, international cooperation, all of these efforts gained urgency and momentum after the war. There was a new awareness, a collective understanding that there had to be limits to human cruelty, even in war. The very concept of international law gained traction. Culturally, the war became a defining story. Think about how many books, films, and documentaries have been made about World War II. From Saving Private Ryan to Band of Brothers, The Diary of Anne Frank to Schindler's List, from the war crimes trials to spy thrillers, even video games and board games continue to explore that era. Why? Because World War II offers the full spectrum of the human experience. courage and cowardice, sacrifice and selfishness, love and hate, resistance and complicity, and the lessons. They're not always easy, but they're essential. World War II taught us that democracy is fragile, but it also showed us something else, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. A French teenager sabotaging German supply lines, Japanese-American soldier fighting for the US, while his family was in an internment camp, a British codebreaker quietly helping end the war 2 years early, a mother in Poland hiding Jewish children in her basement, a nurse in the Pacific treating the wounded under fire. History isn't just made by generals and presidents. It's made by people, like you, like me. And that's perhaps the most powerful legacy of all, that we have agency, that we can stand up, that we can resist hatred, fight injustice, and build peace not just after a war, but before one begins. Nationalism, extremism, authoritarianism, propaganda, economic inequality, the same forces that fueled World War II have not disappeared. They've evolved, moved online, changed faces. Today, the world still faces many of the same tensions, which means remembering isn't enough. As warning signs, as inspiration, as a call to stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and stay engaged. We have to act on what we remember. We have to teach history not just as names and dates, but as lived experience. World War II ended in 1945. It was the costliest conflict in human history, but also one of the most transformative. It taught us what we're capable of at our worst and at our best. But its echo still shapes our politics, our alliances, our fears, our dreams. So as we look forward, let's keep looking back, not to dwell in the past, but to carry its lessons with us. Because the story of World War II isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to do with what we know. And maybe, just maybe, remembering that is how we make sure it never happens again. Fade to black.